So this part of our program is going to be dealing with a New Testament book called the Book of Acts. And Acts is the bridge between the four Gospels and the epistles. And so it's a valuable book from a historical perspective. And whilst primarily is history, there's also some key points of theology. So the basic outline of the book is already introduced in chapter 1, verse 8, that when they go out, they should begin in Jerusalem. And that's what they do from chapter 2 through chapter 7. He's focusing on Jerusalem and beginning to reach out to Judea and Galilee. But then secondly will be Samaria, and that is in chapter 8. And then he never actually mentions the Gentiles, but uses the phrase into the outermost parts of the world. And people not checking out that phrase from its usage in the Hebrew Bible begin to assume that that means the New Zealand, Australia, all those outer parts of the world. However, in Isaiah, for example, in chapter 49, verses 5 and 6, it points out, uses the phrase that the light will go out to the Gentiles, to the outermost parts of the world, and that is a phrase referring to the Gentile world. So if they only got the Gentile world, even within the book of within the land of Israel, which happens in the book of Acts, is the fact that they do go out to that Gentile people already, beginning in chapter 10, actually, with the house of Cornelius. So the outline of chapter 1, verse 8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world is the outline of the book. And only towards the latter part of the book did they realize the other parts of the world means the Gentile world, no matter how far these Gentiles may be, even if they're within the borders of the Promised Land, which is the case in chapter 10. So this is the commentary that we have, and it's a detailed commentary verse by verse. Let me point out certain distinctives within this book, besides the order geographically and so on. In that, there's certain key points. For example, the introduction of the baptism of the Spirit. The Spirit was very active long before Acts chapter 2. The first time the Spirit is mentioned is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The Spirit brooded upon the face of the waters. And you read the Spirit coming upon this person or that person, even indwelling, because he always indwelled the prophets and so on. But certain changes began to take place with the Spirit as of Acts 2, verses 1 through 4, and that is Spirit baptism. Now, Spirit baptism has a specific purpose, but let me point out a problem, in that Spirit baptism is not mentioned in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. It mentions being filled with the Spirit, but being Spirit-filled is not the same as being Spirit-baptized. So how do we know? That's where Spirit baptism began. Would just be in Acts chapter 1, verse 5, he tells the disciples, "Ye shall be baptized by the Spirit not many days hence." So they hadn't received Spirit baptism yet, but they would be not many days hence, and that would be 10 days later. Then Spirit baptism began in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4, but how can we prove that? We go to Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. In Colossians 1:18, the church is identified as the body of the Messiah. The body of the Messiah is the Keilah, the Ecclesia, the church, the body of the Messiah. The body of the Messiah happens to be the church. And so that's what the body is. Now, how do we get into the body? Next passage to note is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13. By one Spirit will be baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether bond or free, are all made to drink of one Spirit. So we enter the body by Spirit baptism. So the church is the body of the Messiah. We enter that body by Spirit baptism. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 18, Ephesians 2, 11 through 18, the composition of the body are all Jewish believers and Gentile believers. That's the composition. So 3 things so far. The church is the body of the Messiah. We enter the body by Spirit baptism, and the body consists of all Jewish believers and all Gentile believers. And now back to the book of Acts. So when the Spirit baptism began, again, we don't see that in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. But we go over to Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 9, Paul is saved and is commissioned to be the apostle to the Gentiles. However, back in Matthew chapter 16, when the church is introduced for the first time, and only Matthew talks about the church, he points out that the church is going to be introduced sometime later. And he says to Peter, upon this rock I will, simple future tense, I will build my church. So the church did not exist in the Old Testament. It didn't exist in the Gospels. So it began to exist only in the book of Acts. However, Paul does not have the keys to the kingdom. So he can now introduce the Gentiles into the body. But Peter's the one with the keys. So in Acts 2, he represented the Jewish community. In Acts 2, the Spirit falls upon the Jewish believers. From then on, the moment the Jew believed, he was baptized by the Spirit into the body. Now, in Acts 8, it is Philip that goes out to Samaria. And Philip is the one who gets the gospel message to the Samaritans, and many Samaritans believed. They received the regeneration ministry of the Spirit, but none of them were baptized by the Spirit. And why not? Philip has the gospel, he doesn't have the keys. And so the church of Jerusalem sent Peter to the Samaritans, and by the laying on of hands by Peter, they received the Spirit baptism. And so from then on, he opened the door for the Samaritans. From then on, every time a Samaritan believed, he was baptized by the Spirit into the body. Then we come to Acts 9, where God saves Paul and commissions him to be the apostle to the Gentiles, but Paul doesn't have the keys either. So in Acts 10, who does God send to the home of Cornelius, the home of uncircumcised Gentiles? Not Paul, but Peter. And through Peter, the Gentiles are baptized by the Spirit that opened the door for the Gentiles. From then on, every time a Gentile believed, he was baptized by the Spirit in the body. But furthermore, he stayed with the uncircumcised Gentiles to disciple them. That's okay. But he also ate at the same table with them, and that was not okay in the Jewish context, even in the Messianic Jewish context of that day. And so we come to Acts chapter 11. And in verses 2 and 3, Peter gets back to Jerusalem. He's attacked by his fellow congregants of the Keilah or Ecclesia or Church of Jerusalem, attacking him for what he did. So Peter defends himself in two ways. First of all, he told them about the vision that God gave him. In Acts 10, he could not be disobedient to the heavenly vision. But then came the key passage in chapter 11, verses 14 and 15 and 16, where he points out that as he began to speak to these Gentiles, they believed, and then the Spirit fell upon them. And then that's the first time the Spirit falls upon them. But the very next verse says, then I remembered what the Lord said. And then he quotes Acts 1:5. You shall be baptized by the Spirit not many days hence. Just connect these verses together. It shows that Spirit baptism began in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4, when the Spirit first fell upon the Jewish believers of the Church of Jerusalem. The Spirit fell upon them, the Gentiles, even as on us, Jewish believers, at the beginning, or in the book of Acts, was the beginning, Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. So that's how we can show that's when the church was born, that's when the Spirit baptism began, and that's a very important theological truth found within the historical book of the book of Acts. And we have many other examples of that nature as well. But this shows how important the book of Acts is. And you cannot really understand the epistles until you also see who Paul was in the book of Acts. Because if no book of Acts, you finish the Gospels, who in the world is Paul? That's not mentioned in the Gospels. Where is he coming from? Nobody knows. And the book of Acts tells us where he's coming from. And we understand why his epistles, and most of the epistles, well, by him, why it's important to know those epistles, and often he himself falls back on that Jewish frame of reference, as in the book of Ephesians chapters 2 and 3, as one example of many.